Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of our 60-day session. I'm House Republican Leader Drew Stokesbury. I've got with me from the House, House Deputy Republican Leader Chris Corey. Also with me is Senator John Braun, the Senate Republican Leader, and I'll let him introduce the other senators. I will just make one or two brief prefatory remarks, which is to say exactly what Senator Wagner alluded to in his Republican response. I guess we will never know which Bob Ferguson we're getting any day of the week. His State of the State speech last year was surprisingly well received by a lot of folks in my caucus, a lot of folks out in my communities. As Senator Wagner pointed out, he had a lot of good lines talking about how the era of big government is over. Fast forward a year later, and he's singing a very different tune. It's the Bob Ferguson of old. I suppose last session it took him about 105 days to fall in line with the Speaker and Majority Leader. I guess this session it's taken him 2 days. But they are marching in lockstep on the idea of a state income tax and lots of other policies that I think will damage Washington. I think it was very telling that with regard to the income tax, only about half of the Democratic members stood up to clap for that. There was one or two other moments when Democrats stood up to clap. Other than that, it was a pretty muted speech and pretty muted reception by folks on both sides of the aisle, I felt like. Happy to talk more about the speech and about some of the other stuff coming up this session, but we'll turn it over right now to Senator John Braun.
All right. Well, thank you, Drew. Thanks for being here today. I'll introduce our Deputy Leader, Senator Drew McEwen, and our Whip, Senator Keith Wagner, is joining us. So you've heard me in the last several years talk about our priorities: affordability, public safety, education, and those are all super important as you talk to voters around, certainly around my district and around the state. But the gap between affordability and the others have just grown widely to the point that it's really affordability, affordability, affordability. That's what is top of mind by a long measure for folks around the state of Washington. And it's good to hear the governor mention affordability in his speech, but I would say he just fails to understand the nature of the problem. This isn't something we're going to fix with more government involvement, more taxes, and more regulation. We need less taxes, less regulation, and less government involvement if we're going to get out of people's way and allow our economy to flourish and let us get ahead of the affordability challenge we have in our state. So I see that we're headed into another 58 and a half days of fight over what it means for state government to clear the path for people to live prosperous lives here in the state of Washington. I think that's going to be centered on how we deal with the operating budget, whether we're able to live within our means, deliver essential services without putting additional tax burden on the people of the state of Washington, whether we're able to respect the will of people on things like the income tax that has been rejected 10 times, 11 if you want to count the initiative of the legislature that we saw 2 years ago, and allow what we've been blessed to see over the last few decades, which is a prosperous, resilient economy in our state that's frankly suffering as a result of now 8 years of Democratic policies. I will stop right there, and I'm going to go directly to questions from everybody here, so we make sure we get through here. All your interest in a timely manner. All right, we count one. Go ahead.
Senator, last year, I think here was when you said, Governor Ferguson, if you want to reform government, which is I think what he said last year, here's your team. Can you tell the story of what happened since then, and do you feel like the governor has done enough outreach to Republicans? He did talk about some bills that he wants to see, that you want sponsored, but has he, I don't know, can you tell the story of that moment of kind of optimism maybe to where you are now?
Well, we're definitely not there now. And just use a few examples. He talked about, about this grant program for law enforcement, which we did get a bill through, but it was just barely a bipartisan bill. And as cities and counties tried to make it work, they're realizing that it was really a nothing burger, and it's really not doing any of what we'd hoped it would do. We talk about even the change to the CCA to make sure farmers and the maritime industry got credit for the cost of the Climate Commitment Act. That's not really it passed, was signed into law, but the executive's not pushing it forward as intended. And of course, the big one is, how do we live within our means? He said over and over last year, and I repeated it over and over last year, that if he didn't want to be in the same situation when he came into session a year later. Well, here we are, back a year later in exactly the same situation, because he either agreed or got boxed in. I couldn't tell you what's in his mind, but in the end, he signed by a long measure the largest tax increase in our state's history, and thought that would solve a spending problem, and it didn't. All it did is further depress our economy to the point that we have lower revenues than expected at the end of session last year, and a significant deficit as we go into a supplemental year. Frankly, fewer tools to address it without cutting services to the people of the state of Washington.
I guess I'll double down on the point. I think it's really useful. The budget Governor Ferguson signed at the end of last session doesn't really match up with the budget priorities he said on the second day of session. Doesn't really even line up with some of the budget priorities he outlined sort of partway through session. Why he made that change, we can only guess. I think another illustrative example is to compare the bills that he talked about in his speech last year versus the ones this year. There was 3 or 4 Republican bills he brought up last year, which were, Republicans have been running for years and running into absolute brick walls trying to pass. Republicans were completely unable to get hearings for bills to hire more police officers, unable to get hearings for bills to fix the CCA for farmers, and suddenly Bob Ferguson comes and starts to talk about them. You fast forward, and Senator Braun's right, the versions that we finally got through the Democrat legislature, I think, weren't nearly the fixes as we would like, but at least something happened. You fast forward to this year, the bills he talked about, they're good ideas, but they're bills that we're probably going to pass whether the governor talked about them or not. They already have bipartisan co-sponsors. They're probably going to pass unanimously or nearly unanimously. That's not to detract from why we should do them, but that's a big pivot from him right there, to go from talking about bills that his Democrat co-partisans in the legislature refused to give hearings on to now talking about bills that will probably pass whether he weighs in or not. He certainly, when he took office last year, it looked like he wanted to be a Democrat, Dan Evans, that Washingtonians would remember for generations. And now he looks like a governor desperate to shore up his base before he's primaried in 2028.
One moment, a couple Republicans walked out on, and Democrats stood up and cheered the loudest at was when the governor talked about ICE agents and repudiated what's going on there with people. They're wearing masks, not driving in unidentified vehicles, snatching people out, smashing windows. Recognize you're not driving the ship here, but do any of you, your caucus, have any concerns about what's going on there, especially if it arrives more directly in Washington State?
Well, I just comment that this administration has been very two-sided on this issue. They don't want to. They say on one hand we're not going to recognize or honor federal law, and then criticize sheriffs in Eastern Washington who choose to take a stance that is aligned with federal law. So which way do you want to have it, Governor? You can't have it both ways and say we're not going to enforce federal law or allow for federal law to be enforced, and then criticize actual law enforcement officers who are doing it. Are there issues, and I understand people's frustrations and angers with what's going on the immigration front. It's a broken system. We're not going to fix it at the state legislature. It's a federal issue that needs to be resolved. And but in the meantime, when you talk to any law enforcement officer, regardless of what it is, whether it's ICE, if it's the FBI, the DEA, the best thing that happens is when you have coordination between various branches of law enforcement. When you don't have coordination, you have chaos. And you'll hear that from any officer in any given department in any jurisdiction.
Yeah, and I think it also remains to be said, people should stop jumping to conclusions, right? We have politicians and others going out in the media and declaring guilty or innocent verdicts before all the facts are out, before there's been any sort of investigation, trial, jury, of their peers. we should stay out of it, right? As legislators, governor, whatever, we should step back and let the work be done. As far as the masks go, I guess my question is, how do my law enforcement officers, my state law enforcement officers feel? Because we came out of a couple very contentious years where they were the targets of a lot of vicious attacks by the Democrat-led legislature, where they were made to be the enemy of the people rather than the protectors of the people. And so here we are back again doing this. One thing, again, trying not to get too into the federal stuff, but we're seeing huge increases of assaults, vehicular assaults, and other attacks on federal law enforcement officers, and then to have either state, county, whoever, leaders basically encouraging that kind of behavior is what's also, I think, contributing to the increased attacks, the incidents, and probably a large reason why a lot of these federal officers are wearing masks, because they have been, either called out directly or indirectly for attacks, both personal and professional.
On the millionaire's tax, do you think there's enough support in that room for that? The governor said it needs to be a constitutional amendment, which would require more. Or is that a done deal? It sounds like the folks on the Democratic side are already working on the logistics of that bill that is going to move forward.
First of all, I'd ask the media to refer to it as an income tax, which is what it is. They're just setting an arbitrary threshold to make it sound better to the public. And if there's anybody in this state that doesn't think that that's going to trickle on down to them and be a broad-based income tax, I would just look at the speech last year that the governor made, and when every tax bill was put before him, he signed them. This current administration and legislature have an unquenchable thirst for more taxes. They might start there, but don't have any illusions that's where it's going to end, and it's an income tax.
So I was the co-chair of the tax structure work group where we studied this for over 2 years. And one thing we did not come back to the legislature with was a recommendation for an income tax. Nobody had the stomach for that. So all of a sudden, you've got this big bill coming up due to mismanagement, and they're going to jump to that? The people have been against it. The tax structure work group didn't even recommend it. And that was a bipartisan work group.
I'll point out the obvious. You ask about a constitutional amendment. They do not have votes for a constitutional amendment. I can tell you that for sure, because there's not a Republican in the legislature that will vote for that. The people have been clear on their distaste for income tax, and then beyond that, I've heard the Senate Majority Leader has been pretty pro on this. I heard a more measured approach from the Speaker, and then I think that we're uniform that we oppose it. But even for the folks on the other side of the aisle that may support it, to try to do something as complicated as this in a 60-day session where we're now in the first week and nobody up here or in this room, I believe, has seen the bill yet, this is a pretty big deal to just trot out after 100 years of saying it's unconstitutional, the people don't like it, 11 times and counting, and we're going to run it through over the top of the people in a short 60-day session. That just seems like a stretch to me. But what I can say for sure is Republicans will oppose it because we know, as Senator McEwen said, that this may start at higher income levels. But there's no question it ultimately bleeds, gets trickled down to every single person in the state of Washington. And while they promise, finger promise maybe pie crust promise, I'm not sure what the type of promise is, that we're going to do some other tax reduction in the future once this becomes a fact. I've sat in several forums in the last couple of weeks with my counterparts on the other side, and people would ask questions about, are you going to fund this or going to fund that? All good programs, generally bipartisan programs, and they said time after time, well, we really wish we could, but we just can't afford to do it. So I could fast forward on that and see, hey, we'd really wish we could reduce the sales tax. We really wish we could reduce the property tax. We really wish we could reduce the gas tax, but we just can't afford it now. That's exactly how this ends if they push forward on this.
They always use the phrase that we have a regressive tax policy in this state to justify any new taxes. But I challenge you, what tax break did they give to the working class in this state? Zero. They always hang that out there, that, we're so regressive. But there's never a property tax break, there's never a sales tax break. The things that the working class are paying the most of, proportionate to their income, there's never a break for them. And we've had proposals time and again. I had a sales tax holiday for school supplies. Couldn't afford it. I had a property tax property tax freeze for seniors that are losing their homes. Couldn't afford it. Guess what? The seniors can't afford their homes. I proposed the P&O tax, ironically, about 10 years ago, that of that $1 million threshold the governor mentioned today. Was told by members that are still here, we can't afford it. They will never give you tax relief, only more taxes.
The governor, what he described, if he gets that, it's just wealth redistribution. He's going to take it from over here and give it to somebody else if they actually got to that point. You may feel how you like about wealth redistribution, but that sounds like socialism or borderline communism to me, to take somebody's wealth and give it to somebody else.
I will echo what Senator Brown said about the Republican caucus. House Republicans are united against an income tax on anyone because we know that eventually an income tax on anyone will turn into an income tax on everyone. We've seen this happen time and time again from Democrat-controlled legislature. The document recording fee was initially $5. It's now $300. It's been raised numerous times. The capital gains tax has only been in existence a few years and already has a new surcharge on top of the initial tax that was passed. The death tax went from being a new idea to Washington now has the highest death tax of any state in the country. Time and time again, you see this. It's not just with tax things. We saw it 6 months ago. There was a CNN article that said Democrats were considering mid-cycle redistricting in other blue states to sort of get back at Texas and some of the national things. Joe Fitzgibbon said that mid-cycle redistricting is not on the table for us. 6 months later, he's the prime sponsor of a bill to put mid-cycle redistricting right back on the table. Jamie Peterson brought to the floor an initiative to the legislature 2 years ago that prohibited an income tax. 2 years later, he's now one of the most vocal proponents of an income tax and said that 2 years ago he was only making a pie crust promise. So I have no idea why the public would ever trust Democrats. Even Democrats admit they can't be trusted. Larry Springer said at a Bellevue Chamber Forum last week that the public should not trust Democrats, that this tax will only ever apply to millionaires. So I think that the record is very clear that a tax on millionaires today will be a tax on you and me and my constituents tomorrow. Chris?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add to that, Representative Stokesbury nailed it, is that the only real tax relief that's been anywhere introduced in the last, 8 years, 9 years that I've been here was the Working Families Tax Credit, and it was only because the Republicans continually pushed to fund it. And we were very clear from the beginning, this is not how we would do tax relief, but it was the only option in law. Democrats passed it and then never funded it. And it wasn't until Representative Stokesbury and others stood up and said, we need to do this now. There's got to be better ways to get money back in people's pockets, and the ideal way is to not take it from the beginning. That's sales tax deduction, B&O tax deduction, property tax relief. That's the real way you boost working people's wages.
And their argument that they're going to reduce other taxes too, rings hollow, as Senator McEwen pointed out. When have they actually reduced taxes? But we can go one step further. Not only have they not reduced regressive taxes, they're actively raising regressive taxes. Last session, they doubled the Discover Pass fee and they doubled hunting and fishing license fees. They started session saying they wanted to tax millionaires and big business, and ended session taxing regular Washingtonians who just want to enjoy the public outdoors. The carbon tax is the state's most regressive tax. It falls disproportionately on lower income folks who live outside the job centers that have to depend on a car to commute to their job. So Democrats aren't just refusing to roll back regressive taxes like the sales tax. They're actively adding new regressive taxes like doubling Discover Pass fees and raising Climate Commitment Act taxes.
During this morning's Democratic media avail, there was a lot of discussion of DCYF and suspicion of fraud. Leadership said that they haven't seen any evidence of that, and that they suggested that DCYF and the state auditor are fully capable of finding. If it's there, they're going to find it. Are you hearing any support across the aisle from Democrats who say they would support Rapporteur's bill or any other piece of legislation that might have a little bit more teeth and oversight and into DCYF, or is there discussion of ways to go about that?
I think DCYF has a whole host of problems that need to be addressed. And frankly, that's probably a bigger conversation than just the fraud. But speaking to that, I believe that there were several audits that were actually brought to light and pointed out that they were failing their audit findings and nothing was changing. So I can't speak to which of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to look into that, but it would be rushed to automatically come out and say there's been no evidence of fraud. And we should go in and look at it and do a objective, third-party audit, figure out what's wrong, and if there are places of waste, fraud, and abuse, let's fix it. One of the things that I think would help my colleagues on the other side of the aisle is the ability to actually put money where it's going to help people. And if they're going to have a robust social safety net, I would imagine they would also want to make sure that it wasn't being wasteful or abused or stolen too, because then that just hurts the people that they're trying to help.
Yeah, I was going to make that exact point. I think there is some support on the other side of the aisle because folks want to make sure that we're not wasting tax dollars. If it's going to fraudulent purposes, that should be rooted out, and we should spend that money in more effective things. And I know there's a lot of Democrats that believe in that. At the pre-session media forum on Friday, the one formerly known as the AP Forum, Speaker Jenkins got sort of upset that me and Senator Braun sort of said we should, among other things, investigate this and figure it out, and she made some comment that it was offensive to the honest child care providers to suggest that fraud might exist, which I think was a very surprising reaction. I'm an attorney. We have a pretty robust set of ethics rules, and if an attorney is found to have violated that, they're punished by other attorneys. Attorneys want to make sure other attorneys aren't breaking the law because it gives the rest of us a bad name. Same thing happens with police officers. You talk to any cop, what should we do about a dirty cop, a corrupt cop? They want that guy thrown off the force. People don't want their professional colleagues to be doing bad things that give their entire profession a bad name. I see no reason why honest child care providers wouldn't also agree that fraudulent child care providers should be rooted out and stop receiving taxpayer subsidies.
And how about the fact, wouldn't a law-abiding child care center be offended and upset that there's fraud going on to illegitimate ones, if there is fraud going on? It's absurd. I think that the Senate Democrat knee-jerk reaction was actually to introduce a bill that narrows the Public Records Act to make it harder for you folks to do your job, because they're trying. Their reaction on this whole issue was, let's make it tougher to look at things and not worry about any possibility. Look, I've not seen anything, but why would we be afraid to look? And former Auditor Brian Sontag even suggested that these are things that you do need to look at.
And you should be clear, the concerns about child care, some of it has come from news reporting, both in other states and here, but the baseline reports that drive this concern come from folks inside state government, from whistleblowers inside state government. This has been happening for some time. So this isn't some crazy conspiracy that's suggesting there might be wrongdoing. There's credible allegations that there's something going on wrong. Whether they're true or not, I don't think anybody in this room knows, but whether they're true or not, they deserve investigation. They deserve investigation because if there is fraud, if there is criminal activity, there should be consequences, because that's taxpayer money being misused, possibly criminally. If there's nothing going on, the people of the state of Washington deserve to know that. Look, if you go out and talk to regular people, including other child care providers today, there is deep frustration. You could even say anger at the way, that sort of indifference to potential waste, potential fraud, potential misuse of government money. People get up every day, they go to work, they support their families, they support their community, they pay their taxes, they do what we think the right thing is, and then they look the fool because they're not the ones that break the rules or might be breaking the rules. Absolutely, this deserves investigation, because the people of the state of Washington deserve to know what's happening one way or the other, and we need them to trust us to run state government. And if we don't do that, if we don't investigate, if we don't look into it, they will never trust us.
To the budget, there was a lot of talk about the millionaire's tax, income tax, however you want to describe it, but even if that passes, that's not going to have any effect on the current biennium, the current budget deficit. Is there any agreement between Republicans and Democrats on how to balance the budget going into this session?
No.
I think there's a little agreement between, there's a small handful of moderate Democrats who agree with Republicans that further taxes will derail the state's economy, that raiding the rainy day fund as the first move you do to balance the budget is a really bad idea, and that repealing the 4-year balanced budget requirement or suspending it is a really, really foolish and foolhardy idea. So there's a little bit of agreement with moderate Democrats. Whether there's enough of them, we'll see. We got 58 and a half days left to figure that out.
Yeah, and just one more thing I want to add. 4 years ago, they raided the rainy day fund under the auspices of COVID, never actually spent the money, moved it to a different account, and then spent it on ongoing things. So part of the reason why we're in such trouble we're in now is because they raided it once before. So this notion that we're going to solve it again by doing it is pretty insane, in my opinion.
It's pretty clear that it's going to be, for the most part, if not all, cuts in order to balance the budget. So where would Republicans like to see state government cut? I know that's kind of kid in a candy store for Republicans.
I characterize it as savings, not cuts. I mean, you have to, and there's no magic solution. You got to get inside the budget and find where services, growth in the cost of services over time is outpacing inflation, outpacing revenue growth, and we know that's true. The three critical things that the state does is educate, medicate, and incarcerate. In each of those areas, the caseload is lower today than it was before. Caseload is going down, and yet expenses are going up. That tells us we're getting it wrong. It could be any number of things. It could be we're mismanaging the money. It could be the Democratic majority's penchant for adding bells and whistles, that we're getting away from the core priorities of government. There's a whole bunch of things you can do to manage that growth over time that they've frankly been unwilling to do. A couple things, at least one I would point out is we've had an enormous growth in middle management in state government over the last 10 years. Enormous. I mean, particularly, we talked earlier about DCYF. If you look at the growth in frontline workers versus the growth in middle management, it's night and day, and if you're interested, we could certainly send you the graph. But it looks like this for middle management. It's virtually flat for frontline workers, where I think many of us would agree they need more folks and they don't need more middle management. There's places like that all throughout state government where we could do a better job of spending taxpayers' money. The one place, I said no earlier, there is one place, at least from the governor's budget, where we agree. Republicans pushed last year that use of Climate Commitment Act money for the working families tax credit was a good idea. It was allowed by law. In fact, it was the top thing on the list of the way that money could be used. The governor, of course, proposes using some of that to pay for that exact thing. And I think in that one area, we are in agreement. That's a place where we can use existing funds, no new taxes, to actually help the folks that are most impacted by the Climate Commitment Act. It's a very regressive program, and that gives us a way with those funds to help the very people it hurts the most.
So going back to the comments Rep. Corey made about the budget stabilization account, the rainy day fund, a recent Pew study shows us second worst funded in the nation. That's pretty disappointing, but when you look back on history, we know exactly why. We're in sad shape for that budget stabilization account. Poor management.
I'll also point out, too, the governor mentioned briefly that the state has a AAA bond rating. That is in part because of our rainy day fund and the procedures we have around that. The more we chip away at the rainy day fund and start using it to backfill budget holes, the smaller our ending fund balance is, the more we risk losing that. We also enjoy that in part because of our lack of an income tax, and I think imposing an income tax would threaten our AAA bond rating. We have much more stable finances as a state without an income tax. So he wanted to take a little bit of credit for that, but a couple of his proposals would actually imperil that continued rating.
The governor today discussed his plan to invest in the state's infrastructure and also to build more housing in the coming years. Are those areas that you can think that you can find commonality or support in your conversations?
So two areas he talked about, one, some in transportation, some in affordable housing. Similar but different in a couple ways. Transportation, I think we have a long history of Republicans working in a bipartisan way to try to build a world-class transportation system. Sadly, we're not getting there right now. If there's one thing that's probably in worse shape than the operating budget in Washington State, it's the transportation budget. And we've said this for many years, we're going to have to rethink how we fund that. That we're long-term, we need to move more of the operating revenues to transportation to have a long-term stable source. It's what many states do. And we did a little bit last year, and we need to do more of that if we're going to get after these big projects. The governor properly highlights they need attention. Not only that, we need a lot of attention on maintenance and transportation, but we need a stable revenue source. And there's just no path with a cap and trade system that adds 60 to 70 cents a gallon, already the third highest gas tax in the country. Gas tax not going to do the job. They did last year in the 2 years before that, they passed a bunch of individual fees to try to fund transportation. But the reality is there's just not that money where there. So the issue isn't a commonality on the need to invest there. It's how we get to funding. On affordable housing, it shocks me that here we are many years into a housing crisis, and the grand revelation by the governor today is we're going to do more of the same. We're going to solve this problem by more investment in affordable housing, when it just doesn't get there. You can't solve our housing problem. It mathematically doesn't work unless you involve the private sector. And the Democratic majority keeps kind of nibbling at the sides when it comes to the energy code issues, the regulatory issues, the Growth Management Act issues. They're stopping investment in housing and pretend we're going to solve it with new funding for affordable housing. And don't get me wrong, nothing wrong with affordable housing. It just doesn't solve the problem. So that I was a little shocked. The big revelation, we're going to do some more of the same that's absolutely failing us and hope we solve the problem. I think we're going to be disappointed.
In Ways and Means testimony, as I understand it yesterday, the governor's staff was asked how many homes that would build in this biennium. The answer was 0. So it's a great headline, but look at what the result is. It's 0 in this biennium. And I'd also point out, because we're always asking, well, what solutions do you guys have? And myself and others over the last 10 years have proposed on the transportation side to take sales tax generated from car and truck sales and have that fund transportation upkeep. And you'd do that over the course of 10 years, and you wean the operating budget off of that revenue. So through economic growth, you allow the operating budget to absorb that loss. Guess what? If we had done that 10 years ago, we'd have a couple $2 billion going in every year for upkeep of our transportation system. So we've had solutions. But again, the majority party and this administration seem to want to double down on the failed policies of the past.
I'll add on housing. I think the silver lining, the prospect for hope, is that there is some agreement on the idea that the real way to solve the problem is through building more supply. So the questions are we going to get distracted along the way by spending a lot of state money on publicly built housing, which Senator Brown alluded to? Just it will take decades, if not centuries, to actually solve the problem that way. So will there be a political will on the other side of the aisle to go after some of the Democrats' sacred cows? I think the big ones are permitting reform, Growth Management Act, energy code. All three of those you run up into some version of local government opposition or environmentalist opposition. But the only way we can actually start to build the more supply that we need is you figure out a better way to make GMA work in the 21st century. You figure out a better energy code so that building costs aren't insane, and you figure out a better permitting system so that it doesn't take 2 years to build a single house.
Going back to the Climate Commitment Act funds, obviously the governor has proposed using those to shore up the working families tax credit. Do you guys agree with that move? And secondarily, that's triggered a lot of other proposals and ways that the government can tap those funds in this time of need. What other priorities or what other ways would you use Climate Commitment Act funds going into this session?
So, I said earlier, I agree with that. That was a Republican idea from last year. We think it's a viable way to use that money. And I want to be clear, we're raising considerable money, or almost $2 billion a year in Climate Commitment Act revenue. If you look at the way that's being spent right now, there's a small portion that's going to transportation, but most of it's being spent on special interest, nominally to reduce carbon. But when you look at the numbers, it's not like we're foregoing some magic reduction in carbon if we don't do other things with that money. And I would say 3 things. One, working families tax credit is a good investment. I have believed all along that is essentially a gas tax, that if we're going to collect that money, and the people of the state of Washington said we want to keep doing that, we ought to invest a much larger portion of it in our transportation system. And then finally, how about we invest it in forest fire response and prevention, where we have a much, much higher possibility of reducing the emission of enormous amounts of carbon. Largest carbon emitter in our state is forest fires. Why don't we take some of that money to cover the cost of forest fire prevention and forest fire fighting?
House Republicans agree. And I think there's a bill coming from Andrew Barkas that would propose a related idea, using the money for transportation purposes, I think connected to some of the floods we had, and we've got a lot of roads and infrastructure to repair. But bottom line is, Republicans feel like it's an extremely aggressive tax that we think doesn't do much good. If it's on the books, we should definitely use that revenue for better good than it's being used for now, and there's a few ways to do it, including how the governor proposed. A couple other ways you could do it too.
All right. Looks like we ran out of questions. Well, welcome to session 2026. Thanks for being here. We look forward to working with you over the next 58 days.
Thank you.
Thanks.